Hello everyone and welcome to Government 340. Today we are going to be discussing Afghanistan. So we've spoken about this country throughout the course, but it is sometimes left out of discussions on Central Asia. So Central Asia is sometimes used to only refer to 5 countries, being Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. So sometimes Afghanistan is left out of that definition of Central Asia. More expansive definitions of Central Asia do include it, and we have been looking at Afghanistan with our discussion of the news, but sometimes in our class discussions, Afghanistan has kind of fallen onto the back burner of these discussions. To make up for that, we are going to be talking about exclusively Afghanistan today in this lecture and also in our class on Thursday this week. And this discussion will essentially have 3 major parts. The first will focus on Afghanistan as a nation state and the programs that they set about to use to build national prestige. The second will focus on the major conflicts that have taken place in Afghanistan, so the major international conflicts being the Soviet invasion and then the war in Afghanistan as part of the United States' global war on terror. And thirdly, we will be talking about problems that plague foreign intervention in Afghanistan. So kind of the things that have compounded the issues that foreign powers have faced when being engaged in Afghanistan. It's important to note that when we both look at the Soviet Union and the United States, both powers were engaged, and in the United States' case, are engaged on behalf of some local governance. So it's not as if they are going in with the intention of being foreign occupiers, although they're often accused of this. These states have attempted to back governments. The United States did help install the present Afghani government, but at the time of the Soviet invasion, they were backing the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, which had been their political ally prior to the Soviet intervention. So unlike a lot of Central Asian states, Afghanistan received its recognition far before the other Central Asian states. So rather than receiving recognition after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, Afghanistan was first recognized as a state on August 19th, 1919, after the end of World War I. Its current constitution was established in 2004. And historically, the state has been unstable, or more accurately, there have been high levels of competition between local actors. And while this competition is not necessarily violent, it can result in political violence quite often. There's also a high potential for ethnic conflict in Afghanistan. So the Pashtun population comprises a plurality, so they're the largest group in Afghanistan, according to 2008 estimates. But the country is also 27% ethnically Tajik, 9% Hazara, 9% Uzbek, and 9% other ethnic groups. Politics in the state have been dominated by ethnic Pashtuns, though, and the Pashtun population is a trans-border ethnic community. So the Afghan border with Pakistan also divides the Pashtun population. This line is also sometimes referred to as the Durand Line, and it was drawn specifically to undercut the self-rule of Pashtuns under British rule. But now you see a lot of trans-border movement of ethnic Pashtuns between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, ethnic minorities are better represented by the present Afghan government, but they have been historically excluded from politics. Ethnic Tajiks, for example, were very closely linked with the Soviet regime that was overthrown in 1978, and they were targeted during the Soviet invasion by opposition forces. And officially, Tajiks have only held power in 1929 for 9 months, and for 4 years between 1992 and 1996. For the second time period that ethnic Tajiks held political power, they were ousted by the Taliban in 96. Ethnic Tajis also made up the dominant ethnic group in the Northern Alliance, which opposed the Taliban government and received aid from the United States and other coalition forces in its fight against the Taliban. Despite the difficulties in maintaining a stable governance in the long term and the kind of lack of capacity that we see on the national government's part, for a large portion of the time that Afghanistan has been a state, you do see them engaging in a lot of building projects, and there has been a large desire to build national prestige. And as a part of this, it's not just about conflict. Monuments are key to any regime, and certain projects have lasted through multiple regimes. So a building project might start during one form of government. That government might be overthrown, but the project will survive because building projects and monuments are so key to the creation of kind of a national identity and of the as like physical representations of the power of the state. And this is especially true for building projects. So if you look at the United States interstate system, or even being able to claim that you have the tallest building in the world, so there's a competition over that title, and it's presently held by the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, but it's been held by several different countries in the past. And once again, being able to say that you have the tallest skyscraper is one that carries a lot of weight behind it. You also have 6 of the 10 longest bridges in the world being located in China. You saw a lot of emphasis being put on the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge in the United States. So these massive road systems, really big buildings, bridges, these are a way to generate national pride, to show resources, and even more importantly, to show technical prowess of the nation, and that the government has the ability to move these resources around to produce a public works of the size that they are attempting to do so. And even more so than roads or buildings or bridges, historically, the building project that would bring the greatest national prestige has been dams. And they have such a big sway on the prestige of the nation and such a show of technical progress because they represent a reconquest of nature. So they can shape all downstream areas, they can control the flow of water, and this is especially important in regions where water is scarce. So being able to control of that not only generates prestige within a country, but if other countries are located downstream along those river systems, you now have a say and influence and perhaps coercive power over those countries that are found downstream. Dams can also be used to generate hydroelectric energy, and they can be used as a means of modernization. So the power that they produce can be used to fund other projects, can be used to provide energy for cities, and they can also be used in irrigation networks to improve farmland. We can see this have particular effect in the United States, and not necessarily with the Hoover Dam, although that generated a good deal of electricity and was one of the major building projects in the United States. But the damming of various rivers in the Tennessee River Valley and kind of the Ohio River Basin really improved the farming production in those two regions of the United States that wouldn't have been possible without the network of irrigation and river dams that were built and placed in those locations. In Afghanistan, their building projects were mainly focused on dams and damming projects, mainly focused in the Helmand and Arkhandab Valley Authority, so the HAVA, the HAVA, which was established in 1952 and was modeled after the Tennessee Valley Authority. the Afghan government started development in the valley as early as 1946, and the U.S. was very heavily involved in these projects between 1949 and 1979. U.S. involvement stopped due to the Soviet invasion, but over that time period, the U.S. financed 8 dams within the region on the Helmand River. However, a lot of these projects were plagued by a lot of environmental problems. So while the dam projects initially increased agricultural production and the average farm income in the valley area, the dams had poor drainage infrastructure and often over-irrigated the landscape, which essentially created an enormous bog in a lot of areas and raised the water table, which resulted in salination. So essentially, minerals were stripped and taken to the surface. So soil minerals were taken to the surface, which stripped the soil of a lot of the necessary nutrients to grow crops. And as it did so, it essentially created salt flats. And you cannot farm on salt fields. These projects have also destroyed downstream lakes. Lake Hamun in particular suffered a lot of damage, and it was downgraded by the Ramsar Convention from a wetland of international importance to a salt flat. And while the project was meant to build prestige, it did not do so because these projects were so highly flawed. And both Afghan and American officials wanted these projects done quickly. So they wanted to build these dam projects very quickly and get the benefits from doing so. But as a result, there was a lack of proper soil surveys and environmental impact analysis that led to huge problems with these dams that slowed down the building process. And oftentimes the dams were already breaking down or had succumbed to huge flaws before they were even finished. And one of the largest dams built by Hava was only done a few months before the U.S. invasion in 2001, wherein it was destroyed. So a lot of these projects started fairly early in the 1940s, and a lot of them were not completed, or most certainly not completed to the size and scope that they were initially planned to be. And the projects were did not bring the national prestige that had been the main goal of a lot of these projects. And this can show how conflict and non-conflict aspects overlap. So the projects continued despite the lack of government continuity, but the lack of continuity did prevent project coherence in a lot of cases. And the benefits were not felt by the population or even the government. And a lot of these building projects wound up destroying large swaths of the environment and did not serve to help the population on the ground. But this doesn't mean that one could not have functioning projects in Afghanistan. So there could be a good dam network that could be built that could supply the benefits that they were planning with the earlier models, but there were inherent flaws in the projects that were attempted that prevented them from being able to be fully realized. Now we're going to switch gears from talking about Afghan building projects to instead focus on the international conflicts that we've seen in Afghanistan. So the first being the Soviet invasion and then the present war in Afghanistan. So the Soviet invasion was fought between 1979 and 1989. So it was a 10-year war that was highly costly to the Soviet army. The USSR was supporting the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and fighting against the Mujahideen and the Maoists. So this was taking place after the Sino-Soviet split, and the U.S. was also supplying the Mujahideen at the time. The Soviet Union had been a long-time power broker for Afghan leaders, so it had a history of picking the winners and losers in Afghani politics. And so they were not planning on a full-scale invasion when they first moved in 1979. They were meant to provide support and pacify regions and opponents to the regime, but this backfired and there was increasing escalation of the conflict. And there were debates in the USSR, both under Brezhnev and under Gorbachev, about the efficacy of this invasion and the continued presence of the Soviet military in Afghanistan. And there were repeated reports drawn up within the Soviet Union about how withdrawals should take place and whether or not they should withdraw. But there was a particularly powerful group, especially in the early 1980s, that comprised of Ustinov, Gromko, and Andropov. So together, these three were known as the Troika, which in Russian simply means the three. And so Ustinov was the Minister of Defense, Gromyko was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Andropov at the time was the head of the KGB. And they also later on, many of these individuals were members of these three also went on to hold various political positions within the Soviet Union after the jumps they held in the early 1980s. And Andropov actually was the head of the Soviet Union after Brezhnev. And so this troika was in favor of the war in Afghanistan, and they were one of the most politically powerful groups in the Soviet Union at the time. And when they were allied on a policy goal or objective, they tended to pull Soviet politics in the direction that they wished it. So despite any hesitancy that Brezhnev may have had about a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, as long as these three were behind it, it was very likely that they were able to control the information and the policy options that were presented. Despite the power of these three, however, U.S.-Soviet relations played a very big role in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So the state of détente, which was an easing of political tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, changed these Soviet policies towards Afghanistan. So the Soviets tended to be more aggressive in Afghanistan when détente was failing, and more willing to consider withdrawal if détente was considered to be working. So their initial invasion in 1979 also coincided with the failure of the SALT II treaty. So the Senate at the time had failed to approve of SALT II, and it looked like détente was taking more of a back burner position in American politics. So as a response, the Soviet Union was more interested in being more aggressive in Afghanistan to kind of offset the American political position. And the intensity of Soviet operations in Afghanistan tended to ebb and flow with fluctuations with the United States and various détente measures. But still, they only withdrew as the USSR started to collapse. So although they did not actually collapse until 1991, you see the beginning fracturing of the Soviet Union with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And that is when they finally leave Afghanistan. And throughout the invasion and throughout Soviet operations in Afghanistan, you see talk among political leaders and advisors to the various heads of the Soviet Union about the probability of withdrawal. But the major issue that they faced was one of saving face. So it would have been incredibly costly to leave without a definitive victory. And the longer that they stayed in Afghanistan, the costlier it was to leave without that victory. The second major international conflict that has taken place in Afghanistan has been the war in Afghanistan. So this is the conflict spearheaded by the United States after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And much like the USSR there has been a lack of a decisive victory and a long and costly war. So it started in 2001 and is still ongoing today. And this, once again, was in response to the 9/11 terror attacks, and it was fought against the Taliban government and the Al-Qaeda groups present in the state. And as a result, it's part of the global war on terror that the United States declared after those attacks. And the U.S. initially had a great deal of international support behind its endeavors. So the initial coalition was of well over 40 countries. While initial combat operations were successful in toppling the Taliban government, members of the Taliban were able to find sanctuary in Pakistan, which enabled them to have time to regroup. And in the new government that the United States helped establish in 2004 with other international actors, this government was weak, and many officials were prone to corruption as a means to fund their departments. And this does not mean that the government was bad or full of bad officials, just that the actions of bad actors outweighed that of good ones. And the U.S. military is great at a good many things, but state building is not one of those things. And this is largely because no one is good at state building, whether they be the United States military or any other organ of a foreign government. State building is an incredibly difficult endeavor to pursue, especially in a foreign country. And while certain elements of international funding and preparation can aid in the creation of a stable apparatus, it is very difficult to build such state organs from the ground up. And it's very difficult to make sure that they are run efficiently and without corruption in the long term. And it's also very difficult to get people to view a new government as politically legitimate. And we've seen this time and time again with state building projects, not just on the part of the United States, but across the globe. When countries try to build new governments in other states, it tends to fail. And state legitimacy plays a very big role in that, where if the people did not design the government, it lacks that mandate from the population. And when the government is not seen to be representative or to be emerging from the state, it's much easier to resort to violence or conflict in order to kick out what are seen to be foreign occupiers, because that message has a lot more resonance when the population does not view the state as one that is one that represents them. And the United States doesn't want to be in Afghanistan for forever, but this creates a problem when fighting an enemy that excels in attrition-style tactics. So the Taliban is willing to wait out the U.S. Forces. So whether they be strictly U.S. forces or part of some international coalition, the longer a war goes on, the more costly it is for foreign forces to stay. And so the Taliban doesn't have to engage foreign forces in outright conflict. It can continue kind of these harrying measures that, while they don't defeat foreign occupiers, mean that those foreign occupiers cannot achieve an out-and-out victory. And as a result, the conflict is much more costly on the side of foreign powers than it is for the Taliban to run. So the Taliban or Al-Qaeda forces can last much longer in this conflict than the political will in a foreign country. And we have very much seen this with regards to both the war in Afghanistan and Iraq in the United States, where public opinion has largely turned against both wars due to their length and the lack of a clear victory or a clear path to victory for the United States. And we see this very clearly in the pattern of behavior. So the U.S. will push the Taliban back. The United States then tries to leave or scale down its presence, at which point the insurgency comes back and the Taliban forces return to the country from where they found safe havens or from where they've been hiding out within the country. And therefore the United States has to stay and or have a troop surge and rinse and repeat. And there are peace talks ongoing for the war in Afghanistan. Presently, there are three-party peace talks. Initially, they cut out the Afghan government. And the Taliban argues that the government in Afghanistan is not legitimate because it is a U.S.-backed government that was placed into power by the United States. And the fighting continues. And it is very difficult to have peace talks when people are still dying. And the longer there is kind of this mismatch between the language of the peace talks and the actual behavior of individuals who are in Afghanistan. So the longer the Taliban says that they're ready to put down their weapons while Taliban members are engaging in acts of violence, the harder and harder it becomes to have credible peace discussions on the Afghan war. And it kind of hits a point of a catch-22 where you can't trust the peace talks, but you also don't want to stay indefinitely, in which case you would need a peace talk, but none of the peace talks work. And this is kind of where you get the term that is often applied to conflicts like we see in both the war in Afghanistan happening now and the Soviet invasion, where these very much become quagmires for the foreign militaries that are involved in these conflicts. And despite the numerous differences between the United States and the USSR, both countries have faced many of the same issues in their conflicts in Afghanistan. So these problems come from incentives to save face of conflict and peace-building structures, of cognitive biases, and of organization and government bureaucracies. And in this third section, we'll be talking about how these problems develop and how exactly the nature of them has impacted the various international conflicts that we've seen in Afghanistan. So the first problem is one of investment. So war is costly and longer wars are costlier. The longer a war is, the more difficult the war is to end without a definitive victory. And asymmetric wars are difficult for conventional armies. So Operation Desert Storm easily pushed the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. The U.S. military quickly defeated the Taliban in 2001 and 2002. Same with the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. Asymmetric forces, however, are harder to combat because they do not meet a conventional military in outright fights. So they're able to hide in civilian populations, and the intensity of these conflicts varies over time. And this makes it difficult to have decisive victory. So it's hard to tell when one has actually achieved victory or if it's just a lull in the intensity of a conflict. And it's also therefore incredibly difficult to plan exit strategies because the actual capacities of your enemy are not known, and you're highly unlikely to meet your enemy in base-to-base conflict. And so while the Soviet Union and the United States had a much higher military capacity than either the Mujahideen or the Taliban forces or Al-Qaeda or any of these other groups that are active in or were active in Afghanistan, this doesn't matter if the groups know how to essentially wear down these larger militaries. Much like Napoleon building the largest army the continent of Europe had ever seen and marching it into Russia only to lose 400,000 troops to a militarily less advanced army, these wars can be tricky to assess from the outset in that it looks like if you were to compare the outright capacity, the manpower, the weaponry of the countries involved, the victor should not be questioned. But in practice, defensive strategies are often more effective, less costly, and easier to maintain in the long term than offensive ones given present military technologies. And this means that the United States and the Soviet Union were at a distinct disadvantage when invading Afghanistan and trying to outroot these domestic military forces. Additionally, the United States and the Soviet Union have encountered a patron-client problem. So both the U.S. and the USSR were trying to build up local capacity. They were trying to build up the national government to make it so that these governments can function without the presence of an outside actor. But the local and national leaders have competing incentives. So as long as the Soviet Union or the United States is there, they can continue to be reliant on the military might provided by those outside powers, which creates competing incentives to not build their own capacity to the same degree as if they didn't, it would represent an existential threat. It's not quite an existential threat to these states at the present point in time because outside actors are filling that gap. So the goals that we see are different between the government and the foreign actors. So in this case, the United States and the Soviet Union were acting as a patron, and it's the client, so it's the Afghan government's goal to keep the patron involved while the patron wants to leave. And so there are competing goals that come with such maneuvers and such relationships that hamper the ability for the patron to leave the state. Patron-client relations also play a role in this idea called siloing. So to silo means to isolate one system, process, or department from others. And this is a common strategy in foreign relations because it's a means to deal with one issue at a time. So when an issue is intractable, so if you know a certain issue might not be resolved, you cannot find a compromise between two groups on that particular issue, siloing is a way to table it for a later date by focusing on a topic where compromise can be reached. The Obama administration often engaged in siloing in its foreign relations, specifically with regards to the United States' relations with Russia, where the Obama administration was often willing to attempt to compromise on several issues with the Putin administration, but the means by which they did so, they would compromise on a single issue rather than on the whole of the relations between the United States and Russia. So oftentimes, like Ukraine or Crimea would be left out of discussion because there was no means by which the United States and Russia could compromise on Ukraine or Crimea. But such issues were tabled so that the United States and Russia could talk about their engagements in Syria. The downside of this is that you can't, it's harder to have an overarching foreign policy strategy when you've separated things out like this. And the converse to siloing is linkages. So this is when a country pursues several policy goals together and links them in order to reach agreements. So if country A agrees to X, then country B will agree to Y. So they're agreeing to different topics, but they're linking a compromise on one topic to a subject in another area of foreign relations. And this was very common between the United States and the Soviet Union in détente talks, because the Soviet Union and the United States wanted to see different deals from one another. It was very common that you would see one side compromise on a certain type of technology, whereas in return they would get a different guarantee from the other side. So it wasn't quite as clear cut, and it wasn't always solely focused on arms even. So you might see the Soviet Union easing up on trade relations in exchange for some sort of technology guarantee from the United States, or some sort of missile reduction from the United States. And this wasn't always clear-cut, but it was a different way of going about international agreements than siloing. And in Afghanistan, we have seen siloing play a very big role. So it's usually meant to be a means by which to partition out responsibilities. And this was both a Soviet and coalition strategy in Afghanistan. In the Soviet Union, it was largely kept internal. So different jobs were partitioned out to the Soviet military and the KGB and the Afghan government, whereas the United States and its coalition partners tend to take primacy in controlling and guiding certain affairs. So while the United States has been in charge of building up the Afghan military, for instance, Germany has been given the ability to coordinate the creation of the Afghani police force. And while the ultimate goals of the various elements of the Soviet state apparatus and of the various members of the coalition are in alignment, the detailed policy goals for specific branches may differ. So the United States, for instance, wants the police force in Afghanistan to take on more of a paramilitary role, whereas Germany saw it as more of a Western-style law enforcement agency. And this difference does not necessarily seem severe, but played out over the course of all branches of government, there is a distinct problem with a lack of an overarching consensus between the various groups. And it's not clear who is meant to be the coordinating actor, because despite this being for the Afghan national government, because it's siloed by the national, by the international coalition, it becomes more difficult for various organs of the Afghan government to coordinate and talk with one another, because the policy goals are set by outside actors and the funding is going along the wishes of those outside actors. You wind up hitting essentially snags, and these snags allow for an easier manipulation of the governing structures by bad actors. So it's not that any singular group or any singular person in the government has an intention to be corrupt or to abuse the system, but the system set about by siloing to create the new government essentially means that there's a lack of communication between governing bodies that enables a high degree of corruption. And as a result, you see the population largely turning against the new government because it's perceived that these actions are supported by the national government. And it also sees them turning against the Soviet forces for one, and the international coalition forces now, because it is viewed that the actions being undertaken by the government officials that are abusing this kind of system are in fact supported by the United States, by the Soviet Union, by the international coalition, which can in turn serve to fuel membership in insurgencies. And we saw this very clearly after the ouster of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, where their resurgence did see a good deal of popular support among the population because of that population's treatment by the new government. Whereas if certain policies had not been pursued by the national government, you may not have seen such a fertile ground for greater insurgent forces to develop, and this is the case for both Afghanistan and Iraq, considering U.S. wars in the 21st century. Thirdly, we have cognitive biases. So cognitive biases are systematic thought patterns. They're not necessarily rational. They are a creation of a subjective reality. If there is an objective reality, it has to be filtered through your own perceptions. And as a result, reality as an individual perceives it is always subjective. Cognitive biases exist because they're often useful. So when we talk about them and when I go over the examples, they're usually viewed as negative aspects of the way people think. And while this is the case, and they can lead to a lot of incorrect conclusions, cognitive biases are a thing because they serve a use to individuals. So they enable faster decision making, which can be incredibly important. They are essentially a mental shortcut to create patterns. And keep in mind that your brain essentially runs on a third of the electricity of a refrigerator light bulb. So you're dealing with very little actual mental bandwidth to interpret reality around you. And your brain is really impressive to be functioning as well as it does on such little actual power. But this is why, like, eyewitnesses are usually absolutely horrible, or if, for instance, the most common motorcycle accident is when a car takes a left-handed turn out in front of a motorcycle, because typically in the dark, when someone is looking for headlights, they're looking for two, and a motorcycle only has one. And as a result, if your brain is only looking for a pattern of two, your brain might completely miss a single headlight. And it's not that it's not there or that it's not visible. It's just that it doesn't match the pattern that your brain's already looking for. And so it is essentially invisible. Very little of what you actually see your brain is observing. You see very little, and your brain fills in the gaps for you. And this is great because your brain wouldn't be able to actually process everything that you see, that you hear, that's going on around you. But it means that to make up the essentially the gaps, your brain has to fall back onto these kind of cognitive biases. And while it is easier to understand how they might impact like visualizations or things that you hear, cognitive biases are mental shortcuts for how thoughts happen. And they essentially create patterns of thought that allow you to reach conclusions faster, but that conclusion that you reach, while it may sometimes be correct, is oftentimes incorrect. And we can see the influence of several of these cognitive biases in the conflicts that have taken place in Afghanistan. And we can also see them in the issues that we talked about in the first part of this lecture, where the Afghan government itself was kind of falling into these cognitive biases when trying to execute these building projects. I won't go into detail right now with how the Afghani conflicts have kind of been characterized by these various cognitive biases, but I will be asking about them in our class discussions, so keep them in mind for how you think these biases might impact the conflict. And I'll be really interested to hear how you think they apply to Afghanistan or other conflicts that the United States has been involved in, or other conflicts that we've seen happening in Central Asian space. So the first is the ambiguity effect. So this is where people avoid options where the probability of a favorable outcome is unknown. So if you don't know the likelihood of success, or even if you know that it's not likely to fail, if you know that it's not likely to succeed, so if it were to have like a neutral or favorable outcome, you won't actually pursue it if you don't know that it has a favorable one. Anchoring is a tendency of people to rely on one trait or piece of information while making a decision. And it's usually the first piece of information that was acquired on the topic, or the first piece of information that they learned about a certain issue. An availability cascade is a collective belief that gains more plausibility as it's repeated more often in public discourse. And this is where we get the phrase, if you repeat something long enough, it becomes true. So it wasn't true to begin with, but by making that particular phrase or opinion or something that you're trying to make seem as fact, by repeating it often enough, it becomes common belief. So, for instance, about a week ago, I rescued a baby bird. And it was down in the road underneath a tree. So I caught it and I climbed the tree and I put it back in its nest. Now, most people would tell you that I shouldn't have done that because you're not supposed to touch baby birds, because if you touch them, then their parents will reject them. And this is true for some mammal species. So if you touch a baby deer, its mother might not go back to it. But it's definitely not true for like baby bears. But birds actually tend to have a fairly poor sense of smell and tend to recognize their young by sound rather than by smell. So you can actually put a baby bird back in its nest. You have to keep in mind like the difference between like a nestling and a fledgling when you do so. But provided it's really ugly, it's probably a nestling, and you can put it back in its nest and it'll be just fine. But the myth that you can't touch baby birds and that you can't put them back in their nests if they've fallen out is so pervasive that I have to make sure that I correct that belief before I tell them that story. Otherwise, they will think that I did something wrong by returning a baby bird to its nest. And that is very much an example of an availability cascade where everyone is told that you shouldn't touch a baby bird. And as a result, it's an assumed fact, and very few people have the want or desire or need to figure out if you can, in fact, return baby birds to their nests. We also have clustering illusions. So this is a tendency to overestimate the importance of small runs or streaks or clusters in large samples of random data. So this is when people observe a phantom pattern. So if you go to a casino, for instance, and let's say you're on like a slot machine, and somehow you manage to win on the first 3 slot machines that you go to. Now, you are not likely to win when you go to the 4th one. You weren't likely to win on the first 3 slot machines, but because you did win on those first 3, you might be inclined to think that you're on a winning streak and that when you go to the 4th, you will also win. But this is not actually the case because winning in those games is, number 1, rigged against you, and number 2, wasn't likely to begin with. So it was a freak of data that allowed you to win in the first place. So in a military operation, if you see a string of military victories, even if in the larger sample you're much more likely to lose in these fights, when you have a streak of victories, even if in the broader scope you're still not winning the majority of the time, you will still believe that you will win the next one oftentimes because you're in that clustering illusion. A 5th cognitive bias is one that you're probably a little bit more familiar with, which is confirmation bias. So this is a tendency to search for, interpret, to focus on, and remember information that confirms one's pre-existing perceptions. So if you're more willing to stress data that confirms the conclusion that you have rather than information that proves you wrong or that does not corroborate your perceptions. So you are likely to downplay things that contradict your perceptions and upplay the things that do. So even when there is a great deal of evidence against your position, you might still be inclined to continue to believe the position that you have because of this confirmation bias. 6th, we have a framing effect, which is where people draw different conclusions from the same information depending on how the information is presented. So there are several sociology and psychology experiments where they will switch which news source that they claim a given article is coming from in a lot of experiments where they might claim that it's from a liberal news source or a conservative news source, and this will change how people interpret the story that is being presented, even if the story is exactly the same in the study. And this folds rather nicely into a confirmation bias, so these two can often work together. So you have a pre-existing perception of a given news source, and then that helps frame the information that you have, and can cause you to reinterpret it to confirm a pre-existing bias. And lastly, we have one that once again receives a lot of attention, which is groupthink. And this is wherein the desire for harmony causes irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcomes. And so the goal of individuals in a group is often to minimize conflict and reach a consensus. And as a result, there is a lack of a critical examination of alternatives to the position that the majority or most senior member of a group puts forward. And so once again, we will discuss specifically how these different cognitive biases have interacted with the war in Afghanistan, just because it'll be more interesting for both you and me to kind of interpret this this topic together and consider how cognitive biases have shaped both the Soviet and American involvement in Afghanistan. But these are things that everybody engages in. You might not think that you do, or you might not always engage in them, but it's important to know about them so that you can kind of catch when your own mental thinking is falling into one of these patterns of behavior. Fourthly, when considering the failures of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and of the United States and its coalition partners in Afghanistan, as both have fallen into a quagmire in the country, we have this idea called organizational theory or organization theory. And this is the idea that large bureaucratic organizations have a distinctive logic and culture. So the capacities and procedures of these organizations are very distinctive and are different from how individuals may process information. So bureaucracies aim at predictability, stability, and certainty. So a lot of their standard operating procedures are designed in order to create a predictable and stable environment so that the structure of the bureaucracy can continue to function with very little uncertainty. Uncertainty always carries the possibility of failure, so organizations try to protect themselves from that. And as we discussed several lectures ago, this creates path dependency. So early decisions made by a bureaucracy impact it much, much later on, as there's kind of this feedback loop with certain practices. But it also makes bureaucratic organizations slow to innovate or adapt. Whether these are their plans, their strategies, or even their standard operating procedures, we're likely to see innovations when they fail, when they face pressure from the outside, or the organization wishes to expand. But oftentimes, this innovation comes a little bit too late to actually address the issue that triggered the innovation. So if an organization has failed in some way, or if it's being pressured from the outside, the issue that it needs to respond to may have passed by the time the bureaucratic apparatus has actually shifted enough to address a new problem. But the stability and predictability that the bureaucratic structure leads to means that in peacetime, in normal operations, the organization is able to better operate. It's when it faces pushback and needs to innovate or adapt to a given issue quickly that this process kind of breaks down. But in most cases, in most time frames, having that bureaucratic framework actually eases the ability of the organization to function. And it's important to note here that the military is a bureaucracy that is very much subject to a lot of these features, where the military wants standard operating procedures, it wants stability, it wants certainty with its strategies, because if it knows what to do in battle, in any sort of conflict, then there is perceived to be less of a probability that it will lose, that it will be able to communicate to its officers and then to enlisted members what needs to happen for a military policy to be successful. And the military does innovate and it does adapt. It's just sometimes too slow to do so when it is faced with a scenario that the military apparatus did not predict. And in many ways, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are wars that the bureaucratic apparatus and their political corollaries did not predict. It was not predicted that these would be such long-term wars, that they would be primarily asymmetric wars, and the introduction of coin and counterinsurgency warfare was developed in response to these wars. But it was not the strategy that the United States had going in. So a lot of the new strategies had to be developed after these wars started, which led to a lot of potential missteps early on because changing that policy took time. So throughout this lecture, we've been primarily talking about conflicts other countries have had with Afghanistan. And the country has been one that has been particularly war-torn. And for that reason, it is a site that receives more international attention than some of the other states in Central Asia. But this does not mean that the future for Afghanistan is entirely bleak. We have seen Afghanistan recover from conflicts in the past, where the government has recovered, where the people have recovered, and as shown by the first part of this discussion, despite the failures, the government has been involved in numerous large-scale building projects. And while a lot of those projects have been failures, the government was still able to coordinate to build those projects, and it's more so of a problem of the devil's in the details when constructing major projects rather than a failure to want to pursue major building projects or wanting to create a better environment for farming and for the population. And Afghanistan has really had to deal with the problem of insecure borders and the problem that this has created for conflict duration, where in both the Soviet invasion and in the present war in Afghanistan, the fact that groups can very easily cross the border into Pakistan has caused these conflicts to be much longer than they would have been otherwise. The fact that groups can seek safe havens in other states and then come back into Afghanistan later on to restart or re-intensify conflicts has greatly hindered the ability of either the Afghan government or foreign actors to end conflicts. We've also seen numerous issues with investment where foreign countries have invested a lot of money in Afghanistan. A lot of money, a lot of blood, a lot of sweat and tears have gone into both the conflicts and the building projects that we've seen. And that investment makes it harder for foreign actors to exit because they have generated such sunk costs. And without a complete building project, without a decisive victory, it is incredibly difficult to leave. And in the interim, it appears as if costs are only increasing while the probability of a decisive victory does not increase. There's numerous issues with the portrayal of the conflicts in Afghanistan and how the leadership in Afghanistan is portrayed and how various opposition forces are portrayed. The popularity of such conflicts in the United States plays a really big role in how U.S. politicians talk about the conflict and in how political leaders talk about withdrawal from the wars. So much like the the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan ebbing and flowing with détente with the United States. You see U.S. politicians very much reliant on the political will of the population, especially the president, for the level of troop involvement in Afghanistan. And as we'll discuss in our class discussion, there are numerous issues with how we think, with how cognitive biases have controlled and influenced the way we think about the war in Afghanistan and how we consider past conflicts, and how this has shaped the consideration of potential peace solutions in the country. There are also issues with how we organize. So elements of state bureaucratic apparatuses influence how wars are fought. They influence how the military operates during peacetime. They create standard operating procedures, and these are difficult to change. And while change may be slow to come to organizations, in the meantime, wars continue on. So altogether, these issues are ones that we have to consider with regards to the war in Afghanistan, and how we think about conflict not only here, but across the world. And that is where we'll leave off for this lecture. We will be discussing this topic on Thursday. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on Afghanistan.